three things in the speech. First, setup. Secondly, why this is likely to be bad for you in the Trump administration. And finally, why this is not likely to increase your prospect as a law firm post-Trump when that inevitably comes. First, in terms of setup, three things here. Firstly, I just note the context of what this law firm is. They are Washington-based. They obviously do a lot of government work based on that location. Second of all, in terms of what the counterfactual looks like, I think this probably looks similar to how Harvard has rejected Trump's demand upon them and not capitulated. And it would probably mean, in terms of their operational capacity, relying on things like existing wealth in the law firm, relying on existing connections and cases to survive the Trump administration. And then thirdly, in terms of the interests of Paul Weiss, firstly, obviously, I think reputation matters quite significantly to law firms because reputation is how you are able to gain clients, and that is obviously, as a firm, how you are able to profit and how you are able to pay your partners. But secondly, I would also note that these interests extend beyond the Trump administration. Paul Weiss is a relatively old law firm. It's relatively established, which means that after the Trump administration is over, they still have an interest in maintaining connections into the future and maintaining their ability to be profitable. Okay, first argument, why is this likely to be bad for Paul Weiss during the Trump administration? The main point of this argument is just to suggest you would probably lose money, and that's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, you just lose out on a set of relatively lucrative cases. Those are, for example, pro-democracy cases brought by actors such as Harvard, or by other relatively largely well-funded cases that are just interested in challenging Trump's infringements on democracy. Second of all, it would look like actors who wish to challenge Trump's economic policies. So, for example, obviously a lot of big businesses are incredibly pissed off about tariffs and want to have some avenue to challenge that. But thirdly, it probably just looks like any sort of action that is brought that challenges things in government, even if those things are not particularly politicized, maybe they are administrative things, maybe they are just related to specific departments, because you are not perceived as, I guess these explain why you would not be perceived as the best representation overall. But that is just firstly because you are seen as someone who capitulates to pressure and therefore are not seen as good representation for if you were to be relied upon to challenge anything in government or any of these sorts of things. But also you're just perceived to probably be lacking in some of the important parts of running a legal case. So, for example, your confidentiality is maybe presumed to be more compromised because you have those connections to the Trump administration, and also because you're just much more likely to concede to pressures to, for example, settle those suits. That is why you are perceived as not being a good representation. And I would note that these cases just probably do make up a large amount of revenue in your firm. That is because the sorts of people who can fund large challenges against these sorts of actions are probably just well funded. They are large businesses. Harvard has pretty large endowments. That means you are able to get a substantial amount of revenue as a result of this. But secondly, there are also a number of costs that are imposed by capitulating to Trump here. Firstly, it's just quite expensive to engage in the amount of pro bono work that Trump is pushing for. But second of all, that is probably something he is likely to push for more in the future when he knows that you've capitulated in the first instance. That is something that can then be capitalized on and leveraged on you in later cases. But also just note that time spent on pro bono work is just not billable. That means it is money that the firm is losing. That is something that is obviously pretty bad and expensive for them. But thirdly, they are also just more likely to lose personnel to competitors, which means they just have less capacity to take on the sorts of work that is going to bring in revenue in the future. That is, for example, you probably have a number of high profile resignations by people who are pretty unhappy that you have denounced a partner that they have worked with and had strong connections to. You probably lose people who are forced out when DEI is no longer a thing, who coordinates those sorts of programs. You lose the people who had strong connections to them and are now being sought by other competitors who know they can poach people from those firms. And also, you just look far less appealing to join in the first place because you are, you're trying to attract a lot of Washington-based young lawyers who tend to be relatively progressive. So that just means you have less capacity to do the sorts of things that do generate revenue because you have less good quality lawyers. But finally, I would just suggest you probably aren't likely to gain the sorts of contracts that you are, that is supposedly like the carrot in this case, that you were able to get government work. That is because Trump already has loyal lawyers. He's not necessarily more likely to hire you in this case, but it also just makes you seem like bad lawyers, right? Because you concede to pressure easily, and Trump, doesn't particularly respect that. So that is something that you are not going to be perceived as good representation there. But finally, the quality of your service is just probably worse for the reasons I explained why you are likely to lose personnel. I think this just suggests that you are likely to lose a lot of money as a result of doing this sort of capitulation. However, I think you're probably just alternatively going to be relatively okay if you don't capitulate. That is, firstly, because Trump is pretty capricious. I would point to examples like tariffs or, how he has reacted to international and geopolitical events. And what this probably looks like is once this is out of the news, it is something that can be quite quietly changed, and then, you can get that government work once it is no longer pretty salient in people's minds. But second of all, you're probably just losing money on things that you would have otherwise gained alternatively. Those are the sorts of contracts that I explained in the first part of this point, which is obviously money that is relatively helpful for you. But also, you are just a wealthy law firm, which means you can outlast this sort of pressure. It's probably 4 years. You probably have accumulated enough wealth in the amount of time that you have been a law firm, and that is probably a way you could survive this. But finally, this is just probably illegal and something that you could challenge in courts, and something that you could probably successfully challenge in courts. That is because some courts have tried to maintain their legitimacy by trying to appear strong against Trump in some cases. I would point to examples like, Amy Coney Barrett not being a consistently conservative judge these days, and also because this is a pretty easy way to push back on Trump, because it is, relatively silly, it is relatively minor, and this is a way for them to shore up their legitimacy by being strong on that, and that is probably a case you could win. But second of all, because courts are just much more likely to, support lawyers, because lawyers are part of the legal system and part of the rule of law, and these are the sorts of things that courts particularly care about, such that they would not support Trump, even if they are Trump appointees, perhaps. But also, I would just suggest that courts are maybe selfish in this way. They have come up through these sorts of, through the same firms. They are the sorts of people who have connections in those firms, which means they probably don't want to see them being forced out or denounced. That looks pretty bad, so therefore they are probably likely to support you in those cases. I think the impact of this is just, it is probably a survivable thing if you spend 4 years either relying, even if you have to make cuts, but because you're relying on the existing wealth that you have, you still are able to get the benefits, you're still able to get the benefits of those new contracts. You probably don't necessarily benefit from new contracts from government the way that they are likely to suggest. That probably just means you are able to survive this. But additionally, why you are likely to do better post-Trump, and the framing here is just that Trump is probably not forever. Independently from this first argument, if you are seen as an instrument of the Trump administration, you're probably likely to suffer huge reputational benefits that are just going to impact your ability to reputational harms that will impact your ability to rebuild into the future, which is obviously something that you care about more as a law firm that has existed for a while. That is because, firstly, your reputation is just far, far worse. Trump is likely to be remembered particularly harshly in retrospect and seen as a bit of a black spot on American history, and that is something that you are now associated with as an arm of that regime. But second of all, you're probably likely to be blacklisted by future Democrat governments, because you are just seen as again, you are seen reputationally as being part of that administration, and probably businesses fall in line with this as well, because that is seen as, and thirdly, probably young lawyers just don't particularly want to work from you, and the sorts of lawyers that you're attracting is this sort of firm that is pretty prestigious and large. They are likely to have those, young lawyers likely have lots of options. They are probably not going to, they are able to select other firms other than you, and you'll probably have created a reputational harm. That is something that they would, that would weigh into their decision. So, in terms of how you should weigh this, even if there are the sorts of cuts that they might explain that, destabilize the law firm in the short term, this is something you can rebuild from long term, because you are now you're not associated with a particularly bad part of American history. That means that in the long term, you're able to rebuild. That is obviously incredibly beneficial for Paul Weiss. Very proud to propose.
Paul Weiss's biggest clients are, in order, the Blackstone Group, the Apollo Group, and Northrop Grumman, who are a private equity company, and an arms manufacturer. And the contracts and the way in which they are involved in these clients are very extensively long, they're extensively detailed, and they're extensively profitable. And all of those companies have far more to gain from Trump than they do from a law firm. And it's extensively bad if those firms pivot, because I think it is quite unlikely they will ever return. You lose a huge degree of money, you lose almost all of your reputation, which is contingent on you being able to be particularly good in those court cases. This is extensively bad. 3 bits of setup. First bit of setup is about what the sort of empirical nature of this deal was. It was a negotiation and a contract that Trump signed with this firm, resulting from the firing of Mike Pomerantz, who was a person who was leading the criminal proceeding against Trump, which is why this firm in particular was specific and was important, and why Trump was incredibly intent on going after it. Mike Pomerantz was the one who led a bunch of the proceedings against him personally. But part of the condition of this deal was Trump not, for example, doing any sort of future punitive measures. Second bit of setup is why this firm is extensively profit-driven and does not meaningfully care about its sort of moral principles or tipping left and right. The first part of this is just that they are one of the largest law firms in the world that spent one of the most high-profile cases was representing ExxonMobil in a case about fucking over the human rights of people in Indonesia. And clearly, that amount of human rights abuses has not taken away from their reputation. In fact, I think it is precisely the opposite, because the sorts of people that this firm represents are ones that are known for the fact that they destroy and do bad things for human rights. It is good that this is a firm that can negotiate and deal with those things. It is good that this is a firm that can exist in that context and do particularly well in it. Lastly, in terms of self-selection, that is people who succeed in this firm, people who spend 30 years in the law, people who have to grind set their way up being a corporate slave. These are people that aren't particularly attached to their principles because they've got so many tugs pulling them away from that, becoming staffers working on pro bono cases, etc. They've self-selected into these things for that specific measure. The fact that partner compensation is dependent on profitability means that these people have an incredible incentive to try and be profitable. Lastly, I think I want to note, it is unclear that the Trumpian style this team suggests is going away. They, I think, have a hidden premise in their case, which is these will be a bad 2 years, and then America will return to the style of Obama and Mitt Romney. I think that America has radically shifted for a variety of reasons that will not dissipate. Firstly, because of the fact that things like immigration will get worse as countries in Latin America are more likely to suffer from climate change. The sorts of things that have been so destabilizing for America's politics are likely to grow. But secondly, because of things like social media radicalization, I think more and more people are going to fall in the line of things like MAGA. The most popular podcast in America is fucking Tucker Carlson's, and the second is Candace Owens. This style is not going away. They do not explain that, and I think their case is in a lot of ways contingent on it. First argument, this creates a huge degree of backlash from the Trump administration. The first thing I'm going to prove here is why it's incredibly likely that Trump will follow through on this and not be flimsy. This is for 3 reasons. Firstly, this firm in particular is one in which he has a personal vendetta against for a reason I explained in setup, in that they have pursued specific litigation against him. Secondly, this is a firm he would, as with most other firms, he would want to make an example out of them so that firms in general shift towards getting rid of DEI. But thirdly, they best explain why Trump has an incentive to follow through, because their case is that you'll work on pro-democratic cases against the Trump administration, which explains specifically why the Trump administration would want to clamp down on you so that you do not properly defend a bunch of other cases, a bunch of other pro-democratic cases. So, what are the harms the Trump administration can levy? 5 broad harms. Firstly, I think the nature of the executive order that Trump put out was not only would it prohibit Paul Weiss and from getting government contracts, but it prohibited their clients from getting government contracts. This is terminal, because it means if you are Blackstone, if you are Apollo, if you are any one of the military companies that is dependent on government subsidies, is dependent on government money, you have a vested interest immediately in switching your firm. Why is it the case that once your clients have moved, it is unlikely they will come back? 3 reasons. Firstly, there's high friction cost administratively to moving, which clients will pay in this instance because it is worth the hundreds of billions of dollars their contracts are worth, but aren't likely to do after you come back to normal because I think it is just that there is no incentive for them to do on that scale. Secondly, in a lot of ways, a lot of their clients are pro-MAGA. The Blackstone guys and the guys who are in the military-industrial complex love Donald Trump. They're incredibly supportive of him, and maybe they don't like his tariffs, but notably those tariffs are specific to Trump. When you have Vance, I think it is quite likely they will flock to him. In this way. But lastly, I think in a lot of ways, clients are going to be annoyed at this whole procedure. It's unlikely they ever make the change back. They do not know or do not trust Paul Weiss to stay stable. Why is it the case that, for example, this executive order will succeed? Firstly, regardless of whether or not it succeeds, it creates a huge degree of short-term harm and uncertainty, which is, I think, enough for these companies to move, given there is a chance they lose almost the entirety of their business. But secondly, Trump just does have a huge degree of power. He has the ability to stack things like federal courts that you need to challenge in. It creates a very, very, very likely scenario that these clients immediately flock elsewhere. That is the most important thing in the debate. But secondly, I think it is quite likely that Trump targets personally the people who are a part of this firm through using mechanisms of professional misconduct. That is, Trump stacked the DC courts in his favor, which control the bar association that almost all of these lawyers are registered out of. It is very easy for him to create a bunch of vexatious or not vexatious complaints and put these people and embroil them in that circumstance, which is incredibly bad. But then thirdly, it is quite likely that if you don't work with the Trump administration, any contracts he gives immediately advantage your competitors, which not only is bad for you in terms of you losing money, but is also bad in the form of your competitors gaining market advantage. Why is that such a harm? Firstly, it causes you to bleed things like associates, people in your firm who flock to a company that can pay them more, that can give them higher bonuses, which is debilitating in the long term, which this team sort of hints at. But secondly, because in a lot of ways these contracts are long term, regardless of the administration, Trump has the ability to affect things beyond what we're just talking about. For example, the ExxonMobil contract is one that is 10 years long. Whichever firm Trump decides to bless that to has the ability to have a steady stream of an incredible amount of profit for a whole lot of years. But lastly, this is just far worse for talent acquisition, because there is now a personal risk of liability or legal action against people who are a part of this firm, which means you're far less likely to have people who are good at the law working their way up, and also far less likely to get people at the bottom coming in, because especially for younger lawyers, the chance that they may be involved in something that could be particularly bad for them or could actually personally hold them at risk is quite debilitating. Second argument I'm going to make is around the backlash of clients absent of what the Trump administration does. The first thing to understand, the first part of this argument is just that a lot of the pro bono work they've done has actually been very good in terms of giving them more clients. Like the pro bono work they've done for the Trump administration has been pro bono work helping a bunch of Trump organizations that are gaining in power. It is working with people empirically. It was working with people like Peter Thiel in Silicon Valley and doing a bunch of work. It is good that you get a foot in the door there. These people otherwise would have never worked with you if you are engaging with sort of a pro-Trump style atmosphere. But secondly, it is actually particularly good to be seen as a good negotiator with Trump, because if all of your other competitors get regulated or get investigated into, or one of the other competitors takes up any of the pro-democratic cases they talk about, it is particularly good for you to let your competitors fall on their sword in this instance. Their claim is that, well, that there might be a reputational harm. The problem is twofold. Firstly, they don't identify where the reputation these people care about come from. And secondly, it's quite good to be seen to work with a variety of political groups. Proud to again. Ooh.
If you press negative, I'm back second.
Firstly, on what sort of work this law firm does. Secondly, on the long term. Finally, on the short term. On what sort of work this company does, because I think a significant amount of Negative's case is just contingent on the assumption that all their clients are kind of bad, and so actually having a bad reputation is kind of good, or kind of Trump and Republican aligned. I would just suggest the first part of that this is not OIV knowledge. I think the specific clients of this firm were not litigated in the media, and secondly, I would just suggest it was unintuitive. I think this is a Washington-based firm. Indeed, my impression was they did a lot of government-related work, and sure, some of this is government-related work, like contracting between, Blackstone and whoever, but again, the info slide literally tells us they do various pro bono, pro-democracy work. It's unclear why they would ever invest in this if they didn't care about reputation and if they were solely dependent on servicing bad clients. Maybe they have some bad clients, I'm going to engage with that later, but I think it's also true that they probably have, whether it's Washington-based NGOs or potential in getting class action suits against Trump or getting future government work in the future, or between any firm that is contracting with the government on anything. I think there's a whole diversity of clients that this team needs to engage with, many of whom are massively off-put by this, as Niamh explains. Okay, let's talk about the long term, because I think this is woefully unengaged by this team. They basically suggest Trumpism isn't going away and give some very generic reasons about how maybe immigration will get worse and, social media is polarizing, which, sure, to a degree, but also Trump has fucked over the lives of so many people. People hated the tariffs. Many people are going to remember those long term in the way that they hold on to, for example, losing jobs in where you build things, in those sort of areas, and voted for Trump in the first place. But additionally, people do not like seeing ICE on the street. We saw so many No Kings protests across the country because what Trump is doing is directly authoritarianism. If he sends America into war with Iran after saying he wasn't going to as well, he is just doing objectively unpopular things, siding with Putin, various things that are just seen as crazy. And we've seen this in polling results. Sure, that's an assertion, but I think we will see it continuously in midterms as well, and in people just being scared and nervous about what is occurring in the protests that are occurring, particularly in Washington, particularly on a corporate level and on the sort of, demographic that these firms likely engage with. I think it is very likely that Trump is going away. I think firstly, it is likely that we just do see a more long-term shift towards the Democrats in America, but additionally, I think even within the Republican Party, it's deeply unclear that someone like Vance is going to be the successor or be a successful one. Trump has something, some je ne sais quoi that is particular about him, and I think that means it's just unclear how long this is going to go on. And we just explain why this is awful in the long term and why you should weigh this more highly, and that's because it is reputationally awful for this firm. If you, in the historiography, are associated with the president that tried to do a grab for authoritarianism, that put the military on the streets and put people on planes and flew them to El Salvador, that is not something you want your name associated with always. That is not what you want the average person thinking when they think for Weiss, or the average person looking for a lawyer. But additionally, it makes you look like a weak and wimpy firm. That means you're unlikely to be viewed as a good representation. But additionally, you lose out on the alternative of getting a massive reputational benefit of being a defender against Trump and someone who saw him for what he was, a bully, and standing up against that. And that is likely to mean you are able to actively attract clients. Your name is now associated with a positive thing in the future. Thirdly, on personnel, I have personnel somewhere else. On personnel, they suggest that on personnel long term, I guess, we'll deal with personnel short term later. No one is likely to want to come to you in the future, because even if some people elderly are, happy with this, many young people are just likely to be anti-Trump, already are anti-Trump, and when they have talent competition for other firms, they're just unlikely to want to go to you. It's because your ability to represent it longer in the future. But additionally, it just, as Niamh explains, makes it probably really hard to work with Democratic administrations or Republican administrations that are trying to distance themselves from the Trump legacy in the future, who do not want to be associated with you, which again, when you do a significant amount of government work, is probably a bad thing. You should weigh that exceptionally highly. Even if you lose your biggest, clients right now, and you have a period of economic contraction, maybe you have to fire some of your workers, you go under, unless you believe that this firm is actually going bankrupt, I think it is far more important that you get through this period and are able to exist long-term into the future. 4 years is not that long. It is a time that this firm can likely survive on the money that it has, because of reasons we give you, and I'll repeat later on. I think you should weigh the long-term benefits incredibly highly. Let's then talk about the short-term. This team says a few things. Firstly, they try and analyze why Trump is doing this as an explanation that he's not likely to kind of flip-flop back, as we suggest. They suggest here's a personal vendetta, he doesn't want you doing pro-democracy work and is anti, DEI. I would just suggest the first implication of this is actually very bad for negative. And that's because if Trump has a personal vendetta against you because he views you as your enemy, it is so unclear why he doesn't just want to kill you and send you under. Why he doesn't care if you lose your major clients anyway. Why he's ever likely to give you government work or cooperate with you in the future. Because if it is true that he's motivated by, the fact that he got personally targeted by you, why is he not just trying to kill you long term? Why is complying ever going to be enough to save you from that motivation? But additionally, I would just suggest that this personal vendetta or these motives are insufficient to motivate Trump long term. Trump has a lot of enemies. He has a lot of people who he has personal vendettas against. It's unclear why this is the one he is likely to pursue or continue long term. We suggest that he is someone who flip-flops a lot, that goes back on what he has said, that moves on, that is relatively, airy-fairy and willing to concede to various things. Why this would have been the thing that when it was incredibly unpopular, when it was incredibly critiqued by all sides, because it was directly anti-rule of law, where it would be critiqued by the major companies who are clients of this firm, why he would have stuck with that is really, really unclear. I just think that means he would have been very, very likely to back down relatively quickly, to maybe do this for a while, but then to have his attention shift to something else and undo this when people were looking away. But secondly, this time suggests you'll be hurt. The way you'll be hurt is that your client, Trump threatened your clients not being able to work with government anymore, and this meant that your clients would have all moved to other firms had they done this. The first query is just why they would or be able to move to other firms. Sure, there is maybe somewhere they can go, but it probably just is true that other firms in DC are slightly wary of taking this on. It is a bit of a vulnerability if Trump then is able to target you and have this leverage over you, if you are dependent on that. But additionally, many other firms just are anti-Trump. They don't want all the reputational damages and long-term damages we have explained going into the future by being someone who is seen to be siding with this administration. Secondly, because these clients are big and because this team suggests there is great expense at switching law firms, I think that just suggests they're likely to lobby hard against Trump to, not do this to their law firm that they're friends with. And that means that I think the government does need a lot of these contracts equally. They benefit from having, sure, the companies are subsidized, but a lot of these are business deals which benefit the government and give them things like weapons and stuff like that. And so I think that just, or even private equity firms, I don't really know what the government does to help those. But anyway, that just means that they likely are able to push back against Trump and get this undone. But finally, it is just unclear why you don't lose them anyway. They maybe don't like Trump, particularly if he's doing this to them or if they are dependent on the economic conditions of the US. Tariffs have been bad for that. But additionally, if you look weak, you're likely to lose personnel and be a less good firm. They're likely to want better legal representation than that. Finally, even if you do lose it, we just suggest there's other work you could do as well. Lots of other work you could do. Niamh names this, various degrees of anti-government work that there is money in. There are many corporations who are suing Trump and are willing to pay for that. There are potential class action suits that you can profit from as well. Sure, maybe not the same amount, but again, as long as you don't believe that this firm is going under in the long term, I think that suggests they can survive. Next, they talk about talent acquisition and say people won't want to come to your firm because of personal liability. If you're a junior lawyer, you're not scared about being targeted by Trump because Trump isn't targeting junior lawyers because they're, doing discovery and boring work, not important work. That's something that falls on the partners. But again, there's just the opposite calculus going on as we explain. You don't want to be scarred in your career having entered working for the firm that is both now probably viewed as a less good firm but also as having capitulated. Finally, they suggest the pro bono work has been good for you. I think this is asserted that you're working with good people that are going to be long term and not doing kind of crazy work. But additionally, it's unclear why this would ever convert to profitable work and partnerships. It is free, it is pro bono. Trump is able to put pressure on you to make it always free in perpetuity in the future because otherwise he will threaten you with the things that this team says he holds over you. It's just unclear why it's good for you to be working with that. On the alternative, Niamh explains a bunch of things that you do lose. Niamh explains a bunch of ways that you can likely get out of this by challenging it in court or just by surviving it. It's deeply unclear why it was a good thing to concede to Trump. Cool.
Thank you, second affirmative. That's right, second negative.
Niamh says that, Weiss law firm? Weiss? Yeah, sure. Should look like Harvard. I'm not quite sure why the affirmative team would like that, because Harvard is a ghost town. Harvard is a school that can't have any of their international students at the moment. And even if they do take Trump to court, which I'm sure that they will, they enter themselves into a years-long legal battle with the President of the United States that necessarily harms them into the long term. I don't think that this is a world that the affirmative would like a law firm to look like. I think it is never in the company's interest to create themselves in that way. And maybe you have people like my uncle who work at Harvard and have made us all t-shirts that say we are the resistance, which is great, but unfortunately the t-shirt isn't going to solve Harvard, and I'm not quite sure why that's what the affirmative team wants to stake their case on. Firstly, I'm going to talk about reputation, which is the main incentive prop by affirmative and the biggest harm that they've listed in this debate. And then I'm going to talk about profit, which I think is probably the more proximate interest of the law firm, but whatever, we'll get to that in a second. On reputation, I'm going to start by providing 5 reasons as to why I don't think your reputation gets harmed by the general public. The first one is that people are incredibly short-termist and they just are forgetful, because there are initial headlines about companies siding with Trump and being willing to do things like remove DEI practices, but in the 24-hour news cycle, they just do get dismissed by individuals who don't remember them. And maybe you remember them for 6 months as they claim, but I think it is really unlikely in a post-Trump world that individuals are able to list the law firms that sided and conceded towards Trump's bad policies. That's the first reason. Secondly, people are really understanding of the limitations on companies in the Trump administration world. They understand that they have to do things to conform to them. Maybe they disagree with it, but on net, people get that Trump is a bad guy, particularly the actors that they're talking about on side affirmative, and they're pretty willing to be flexible with the policies that these companies adopt in the short term, in the idea of needing to portray to the Trump government, which everybody notes is obviously one that is quite antagonistic. Thirdly, I think this affirmative team just massively inflates the knowledge of the general American voter. I don't think they're paying attention to the news cycle in this way, particularly so much so to hold big law firms like this accountable. But fourthly, I also just think it's like, people don't pay, oh no, that's not it. No, that's not the one I'm going to say. Oh yeah, also, you are one company within a monolith of other companies that are making these sorts of decisions. It's unclear why you are the tipping point for people to stop giving your company business in particular. But finally, people still need lawyers. It's the same reason why people have lawyers defend them in cases who have maybe defended poor actors in the past, because they still have good outcomes. I think that affirmative claiming that people make decisions based on a reputation of a law firm is just far more unlikely than the actual results that come out of that law firm. I think it is dissonant to reality. The second thing they explain to you is on reputation as defined by the legal system. The claim here is that you do things like lose lawyers. 2 reasons why this is untrue. Firstly, it's really easy to hire people. Why is this true? Firstly, in the past, you hired lawyers internally. Now you hire them through a lateral system, which means you don't need to go within the company's existing portfolio, but rather can go from different law firms. Secondly, you used to have equity partners. Now that is less of a norm, which means it's easier for you to do things like hire on new people in the short term. Thirdly, other people are fighting these battles, which necessarily means that lawyers are leaving other companies, which means a larger sample size for you to draw from and hire lawyers to join your specific company. That is a reason why it's also easy to take on new people. I think that harm from affirmative is nullified. But secondly, we just think it is far more likely that you lose lawyers at the point at which you enter yourself into a decades-long legal battle with the Trump administration. You are able to do things like lose a few lawyers who maybe disagree in the current status quo. I think that that is a much better harm to take on side negative than the possibility of losing your entire team, because they're just unable to get work now as the Trump administration is fighting their law firm. The next claim from the affirmative here is that democratic courts aren't going to want to work with you. The issue here is the concessions made are just nuanced. I think this affirmative team believes that you've done things like hang the Trump flag in your lobby. That is obviously untrue. The company scaled back DEI initiatives. That is obviously not the point at which they have made themselves Trumpists. There is nuance to that argument. All of these harms here should be mitigated to the extent to which you believe the actual impact on the company was much, much smaller than that. But also, Gypsy says, well, we are going to become more democratic in the future. I don't think this debate should be whether the Trump administration is here for the long term, because obviously that is a different fucking question. I think it's likely they are vis-a-vis Trump selling hats that say Trump 2028. He's probably here to fucking stay. But even if he isn't here, I just don't think that's a massive harm to take on in the short term. At the end of that, you all believe reputation is mitigated to the extent to which people either cannot understand the current political climate or are necessarily short-termist with the way in which they engage with it. That means the harms to reputation they claim just do not stand in this debate and are outweighed by the profit motivations we explained to you at Archie. What do we say here? Firstly, Archie gives you a list of reasons and explanations of the legal history of the company as to why they have incentives to be profit motivated. The responses here, I think, are not particularly sufficient to go over this as to suggest that it is not ordinary intelligent voter knowledge. Yes, not to me, but apparently to these two legends at my desk. I wasn't right in that argument, guys. I think that was pretty clear. The claim from the affirmative here is that you lose out on things like lucrative cases, but I think this is just really untrue for the reasons we give you at Archie that just go unresponded to. And that is because Trump administration makes it literally impossible for you to be able to do things like your work, because they do things like cancel government-controlled cases. They do things like revoke your security passes so you're not able to get access to your buildings and your staffers. They do things like have disciplinary proceedings against the people that work for you. They do things like publicly shame you as well. If you care about reputation, you all care about a reputation that at the very least they have more control over, and one that doesn't become the villain in the Trump administration's narrative. That is obviously the way we co-opt this argument on side negative. But also, I just think that not even going to say that. Next, on clients, they say that people don't want to work for you. I just think this is untrue. Maybe there is a large explanation on Ali coming as to why you were able to take on a bunch of new clients, but that is an assertion made by them. Because if you believe their analysis as to other companies are taking the Trump administration to court because they disagree with his proceedings, then you all believe that there are a bunch of other court cases, a bunch of other law firms you can go to take on your Democratic case. This affirmative team never proves why you are the one that is going to win out in the competitive battle to take on left-leaning cases. We give you a certain benefit. Now you are aligned to the Trump administration. At the very least, you can continue to take on the profitable, the high reputation cases that you have a revealed preference to do. They say, well, the company also takes on some lower stakes cases. That is obviously true. And even if these are the majority of cases, they are not the most sizable cases and the most reputationally incentivized cases. That is the reason why the law firm cares about taking them on, even if they are in the minority of instances. Then they say that the firm is not losing money and it's not going to go bankrupt, which means that it isn't a harm. But I just think this is a misidentification of the company's interest, because insofar as affirmative can never explain why you are actually able to continue performing in the legal landscape in a world in which you've entered into a legal battle with the Trump administration, that is not just a short-term harm, but one that continues on post-Trump. There are going to be a list of cases that need to go to court in a post-Trump administration. You were added to the long line of law firms that have acted against his government. That is the bureaucracy that prevents you from doing your job. That is the sort of thing that prevents you from doing things like earning profitability within your company. Maybe they say, well, it's not going to bankrupt you. It's going to be a pretty big fucking harm, but it's just so unclear on side affirmative how you ever take on the left-leaning cases that their case is contingent on them being able to win in this debate. What should you believe at the end of this? Firstly, reputation is mitigated to the point at which profitability is your main incentive as a law firm. There is a revealed preference to take on these high stakes cases. We are the only team that's able to fill that incentive, so proud to negate.
Thank you, second negative. I invite third vote.
The first thing I want to talk about in this speech is why you don't survive in the long term, and the second thing I will talk about is why you definitely survive the period of time in which the Republicans remain in power in our world. Firstly, why are you unlikely to survive the post-Trump world? Regardless of when this comes, it is probably going to come eventually. The Berlin Wall fell at some point, the USSR collapsed, and I would point out the East German companies that sided with the government there and the state-owned corporations in Russia are probably not particularly successful now. That's probably what Paul Weiss looks like in that future. Okay, why can you not get work in the post-Trump era? 3 reasons. Firstly, you are viewed as a uniquely politicized firm. Every other firm that manages to stay out of this, or even one targeted by Trump does not capitulate, is viewed as a firm that upholds its obligation to remain neutral. You are the firm that specifically said that you would do what Trump wants to maintain the government contracts. What that likely looks like is in a future where the Democrats are in power, you are blacklisted as an agent of the regime, regardless of whether or not you actually were an agent of the regime, in a particular type of fear of Trumpism that is likely to occur in America after it collapses. That is how you're likely to be portrayed. But the second thing to note is that there's a separate reputational harm to just doing bad things and having bad clients. That's normal for law firms, right? They have bad clients. People universally understand that's how they work because they're not meant to have specific determinants between what types of clients they take on. There's a specifically bad harm of changing your internal policies due to something that other people have pressured onto you in the first place. The third thing is the reason why the reputational harm is not because people think you're immoral for capitulating to the Trump administration, it's that it ruins your image as a good and capable law firm that will meaningfully be able to defend people. The claim that we make is not about the American public thinking that you're evil, it's about companies doing their due diligence and seeing that you capitulated to the Trump administration, which means that people now feel as if a government employee puts particular pressure on your law firm in the future, that you are more likely to settle for a case that you alternatively should have brought to court in the first place. They believe that you may drop things in the future. They believe that they might be targeted by similar things in the future, by similar sorts of attempts in the future as well, particularly given that if the Democrats are in power and you are viewed as something that is potentially politicized negatively to that, you are particularly likely to be the target of something like that as well. But also just that you perhaps have poor confidentiality, you perhaps are not particularly strong lawyers as well in the first place, that you are likely to change here. So the reputational harm is not that you are evil, it's that you are bad at your job, so that you will not be able to do a good job, which means that whenever companies are trying to do due diligence after the Trump administration, you are likely to get far less business. That is regardless of the political identification of where you're going. Like, these claims also work for the status quo right now in the short term. Even MAGA and Republican leading companies that think ideologically you make a good fit are still less likely to align with you because they think you're likely to, in some instances where they might disagree with the government, give up information to the government or be willing to change your position on the basis of what the Trump administration wants. Notably, you will survive if you would have survived right now for big reasons. There are entrenched Democratic interests right now that do provide legal cases that you could take on, but in a post-Trump world, that Trumpism is likely to be decried even by the Republicans as well as a particularly bad era, as Gypsy explains. So you cannot rely on people who are ideologically similar to you or ideologically similar to that regime in the same way that you can right now if you actively oppose Trump, which is why it's unique to our side. Secondly, even beyond that, so that in and of itself, I think, explains where this screws you in the long term. This means that all we have to do in the short term is prove that you survive, but I think we can also explain that you thrive as well. Firstly, what are your alternative paths to money under this firm? I think there are a lot of their claims about this law firm misunderstand what the environment looks like for a law firm and what sort of clients they take on. Because yes, probably to some degree they have clients that are dependent on government contracts, but also most businesses operate outside of a government sphere. They operate in a private sector. They do not rely on government money to keep them going. So there are just a huge amount of clients that are unlikely to be impacted by the Trump administration's targeting in a particular way. They wouldn't give them government clients in the first place. And this is all explained at Niamh as well. So you maintain the majority of your business, the majority of your business is just not affected by this threat to the degree that they suggest that it would be. But secondly, we explain that you get a bunch of opportunities under our side of the house that only occur under our side of the house, because there is literally no way for them to guarantee them in the other case. Because of what I explained, that this company is viewed as one that specifically will capitulate to Trump's demands, is likely to be a worse law firm at defending them, and stuff like that. So that can only happen under our side of the house. They try to respond and say, well, if there are all these cases against Trump, you can just take on the opposite side. But firstly, the cases against Trump are likely to be more lucrative because they are brought by businesses as opposed to being paid by the governments. The amount of money you're likely to get is far higher. But secondly, the Trump administration already had, the people that they're attacking here are the government, who already has their own lawyers in-house, and it's unlikely to be hiring for law firms outside of that as well. But also, and they have their own government lawyers who are unlikely to get these contracts as well. But thirdly, your reputation, I think, even just within the Trump administration is absolutely ruined here. I don't think they ever explain to you why capitulating in this one instance solves all your problems for the future, as opposed to just illustrating to the Trump administration that you capitulate easily. I think in many of these circumstances, you're unlikely to get the alternative revenue from defending the other side, because at this point, you've demonstrated that you are not a particularly consistent law firm. There are obviously preferable law firms that they could allow to defend them. And also, they're probably be more likely to contract another law firm as well, because they are specifically unpoliticized as well. Alternatively, you're much more likely to get the left-wing cases if you have specifically said no to the Trump administration. Obviously, that then flags you as someone that would be a good defense and is willing and is consistent in standing up against Trump, whereas you don't necessarily have that for other law firms. So obviously, you attract things far better under our side of the house. Finally, we also just explained that you maintain employees as well under our side of the house. The way this has worked empirically is that when Paul Weiss did this, companies sent, employees within the company sent mass company-wide emails explaining why they were resigning. That's particularly bad for you as a law firm as well, because this is how you lose your regular clients. When lawyers within your firm take their clients to other firms
firms who are now offering them and stepping in and offering more money than they would have alternatively. This gives up your best asset to your competitors. So even if you want to take on all the contracts that they talk to you about you could potentially have, you don't have the capacity to, because you no longer have the best lawyers that you had in the past. What this explains is there are alternative sources of income that exist for these companies right now. So even if you were to lose the big contracts that they tell you about, there are several other things that would actively likely to make this up, especially because you framed yourself as a company that's willing to oppose Trump in this circumstance. So you're not likely to lose a particularly large amount of money because these are likely to come in instead. Also, you don't have the capacity to deal with all the good benefit opportunities that they talk to you about. But secondly, why does this just not benefit you in the way that they say? The first thing to talk about is why you maintain your clients. The first thing is, to the extent these clients are relatively rich and they have engagement with government and stuff like that and negotiating power there, they obviously don't want the friction cost that they identify of having to move to other firms. So they are likely to lobby Trump internally to drop this idea in the first place, which means it's pretty likely that what we say that Trump is capricious happens not only because of Trump himself, but because the clients that you have are also likely to push for that if you suggest your own incentive to not let that go in the first place. But secondly, I just don't think they have that much of incentive to leave to another firm either because of, again, the friction cost that they identify, which is this is pushed against Paul Weiss first. But your concern is you go to another company and then the same thing happens again and you have to leave to another company as well, which just means you have much more incentive to stay in one place and see how it goes for a period of time. You certainly don't leave immediately. You give it some time to see how it shakes out, and probably in the period of time that does shake out, things change. The third thing is to just point out that the law firms in the status quo just do have a diverse set of clients. They have left-wing, right-wing companies insofar as companies are left-wing and right-wing. They are genuinely willing to stay with companies that don't necessarily have the same political beliefs as them because that is how law firms work as well. So they're unlikely to just leave you because you oppose Trump on that basis alone. But the second thing to point out is they just don't explain why you get any extra revenue from doing this. Like, you just illustrate to the Trump administration that you're willing to take on Trump administration work pro bono at the point at which every single other time one of these groups wants you to do work, they pressure the Trump government to give you pro bono, and the Trump government knows that you're likely to capitulate to it being pro bono because you did it in the first place. They know that if they push your buttons hard enough, then you are likely to end up being able to make you do whatever you want. So it's not the case that you get right-wing work from this. You get more right-wing pro bono work, which we explain is just dreadfully expensive, right? You have to pay your lawyers to do something that they would not be doing otherwise. You're actively losing money. You don't get any of the benefits aside from the reputational cost that we explained to you as well. The final thing is just to point out that you could just defeat this in the Supreme Court, and it's likely to be relatively successful. Judges are people who once worked in these law firms themselves. They have personal connections here. But to the extent that people in the Supreme Court to some degree want to maintain that court's legitimacy, this is the best way to do it. It's relatively uncontroversial that the government should not be able to block a law firm from having these contracts, and this is the time that they're likely to stand up to it more than anything else. At the end of this debate, very proud to propose.
I'm going to begin by talking about the work that they say you lose out on as a result of taking the deal, and then I'm going to talk about the work that you gained as a result or maintained as a result of making the deal. But before that, I want to provide 2 points of weighing. Firstly, short-term profit is extremely important to law firms because short-term hits to profit have long-term impacts. Because law firms are often ranked on their profitability or profit per partner, and that affects both how clients perceive you because it's seen as a marker of how good you are or how effective you are as a law firm, but it also affects the decisions of up-and-coming, ambitious and hard-working lawyers when they're deciding where to work, when they're deciding when they get made partner, how much money they'll work. So short-term changes to profit have long-run implications for these firms. But the second piece of weighing is that of the big East Coast law firms, Paul Weiss was one of the few ones who did make a deal with Trump. That's why the debate is about them and the media coverage focused on them. So to the extent that there are two pools of work that Paul Weiss could tap into, it is better to do something that is different from your competitors so you can get a bigger share of the pie in doing so. Now, let's talk about the first issue, which is the work that they say you missed out on as a result of taking the deal. Their strongest claim, and the one they rely on the most, is that it is bad to be perceived as too Trump-aligned both during and after the administration. The first observation I'd make about this is I just do not think that this team proves that Paul Weiss, which is a historically left-wing aligned law firm, would be perceived as being so Trump. Hakeem Jeffries, the current Democratic Speaker of the House, used to be a partner at Paul Weiss. The past few Democratic attorney generals work for this firm. It's extremely unlikely that they would ever be perceived as a MAGA pro-Trump firm. But secondly, people view it as a deal and a survival strategy and not a pledge of political allegiance to Trump. This was a decision that the mostly left-wing partners at the firm made for their own survival instincts. And that was how it was announced at the all-staff meeting when they announced the deal. That's how it was discussed in media releases that were posted on the website and that were discussed in the legal community. That's how it was discussed in legal newsletters. But thirdly, in the long run, I actually don't think this team steps through why clients will so inexplicably connect Paul Weiss to any of the bad things that they describe Trump has done. And I would note, most of their explanations for why the enmity towards Trump will be so long-lasting are about specific policies that regular Americans might be upset about. But they don't explain why large American corporate giants would make their decisions about who to hire for their legal work so irrationally or vindictively. And if it is true that Trumpism is likely to die out as a political movement, it's unclear why the that is directed towards it would so affect these firms' decision of which law firms to go to in the future. But fourthly, I would actually say that unlike what they say, clients are likely to perceive this as a commitment of loyalty to their clients because Paul Weiss has put their politics aside in order to protect the interests of their clients, which is a sign that they are a loyal law firm who is willing to do what is required. For instance, to protect the government contracts that their clients have or protect their clients from backlash and recrimination by the Trump administration. So I think that takes out that particular claim. Their next claim of work that you lost out on is that they say, well, you lose out on the opportunity to do anti-Trump litigation during the Trump administration. Firstly, this is unimportant because litigation, as opposed to corporate law work, like for instance, writing contracts or structuring mergers and acquisitions or IPOs, is a smaller proportion of Paul Weiss's work and is importantly less profitable in general. Because unlike for litigation, if you're doing corporate things like writing contracts, your payouts are not contingent on you winning or losing the cases. And clients like bulge bracket investment banks have far more ability to pay you for that sort of work than, for instance, Harvard could give you by doing litigation on their behalf. But secondly, not many there just aren't many anti-Trump cases numerically compared to, for instance, the amount of other work that you could get that we describe you risk by not making a deal. Maybe you could do a handful of cases on behalf of Harvard, but that is not sufficient. Thirdly, the type of pro-democracy or anti-Trump cases that they describe aren't that profitable. The plaintiffs don't have deep pockets. Yes, Harvard has a lot of money, but large American corporate giant firms have far more money and are willing to give you like huge hourly wages. And fourthly, you have to win these cases to get the payouts or to get the benefit in many times. And many of the constitutional challenges to Trump's legislation that they would, for instance, at first for negative support, First Affirmative support doing instead, are just unlikely to win. Oftentimes, they're politically motivated challenges against perfectly legitimate forms of lawmaking done by the Trump administration. And there's a harm if you attach yourself to those cases and you lose because you don't get the payouts in the same way that you would doing other sorts of work. They say that the pro bono work that you do for the Trump administration is costly, but the observation I'd make about this is law firms like Paul Weiss have to do a certain amount of pro bono work anyway. So I don't think it comes at an opportunity cost of doing money-making work that is bringing in a lot of funding to the firm. And oftentimes it's like a condition of lawyers being admitted to things like bar associations that they do a certain amount of pro bono work.
Their final claim on what you miss out on is progressive young lawyers don't want to work for you. But firstly, this is contingent on it being perceived as a political and rather a pragmatic decision, which I've already responded to. Secondly, I actually don't think many lawyers are super political. The UCID Law Society definitely isn't. They couldn't give a shit about most political issues. Many of them come from very white, very wealthy families. Many of them are ambitious and prioritize their career and their money making over, for instance, politics. But thirdly, much more relevant to that group of people is how profitable the firm that they're going to be, whether or not they have a personal political vendetta against them as a result of the Trump administrations, or for instance the fear, even if it is a small one, of Trump administration taking disciplinary proceedings against people who work at the firm that you're going to work at in the future. Now let's talk about what you potentially gain by making a deal. We explain that your clients are likely to leave you because they have threats. The Trump administration threatened to cancel many of their government contracts. They say, oh, well, these clients don't have many government contracts, but they do. These are defense companies, these are energy companies, agricultural firms, or consulting and accounting firms, a huge amount of whose income comes from the government. And the US spends a large amount of money compared to other nations on that sort of stuff, due to, for instance, the lobbying and corporate capture that happens in the agricultural and energy sectors. Secondly, the Trump administration could also do other retaliatory actions against these companies, for instance, by regulating them more harshly. And thirdly, many of these companies are scared of seeming woke or left aligned at the moment, when there is especially such a culture of, for instance, attacks on these large firms for doing things like being involved in DEI. We also explain that you directly lose out on government contracts, which is a large amount of the work that Paul Weiss does. They say this is a small harm because you wouldn't secure government contracts under the Trump administration anyway. But firstly, lots of ongoing contracts that were going to be cancelled were upheld when Paul Weiss made the deal. And they agreed, and the reason they agreed to do this deal was because the Trump administration was giving them good terms. They were saying that you would continue these contracts and you would get a lot in return. But secondly, lots of other big white shoe law firms didn't make a deal. They chose to challenge the executive order in court, and Trump did terminate all of their government contracts, which explains there's a lot of slack for you to pick up and government contracts for you to move into under the Trump administration. Thirdly, they say the government has its own lawyers. Of course, that's true in some instances, but oftentimes governments outsource this work to a large specialized law firm who's very good in the type of work that the government may not specialize in. The next thing they say is, well, the executive order is not legitimate, it could be challenged in court. Firstly, there's a huge short-term impact regardless of your contract being terminated, of your clients leaving you, of the perception of you being anti-Trump. But firstly, it probably is legitimate. The government can decide freely which law firms it wants to use as its use and which ones it cannot use. Secondly, the federal courts at the moment are very pro-Trump because he got lucky with the large number of vacancies in federal appellate courts and also in the Supreme Court if it eventually got appealed there. And thirdly, a lot of these right-wing judges specifically don't like Paul Weiss because it is seen as a left-aligned law firm. Finally, they say clients won't go to other firms because there are frictional costs of switching law firms. But these are big firms that have lots of ongoing legal work. They have lots of IPOs or mergers or contracts that you could write. And there's not a big frictional cost of you for your next contract that you want written to go to a different law firm. For all of those reasons, negate.
All right, thank you for Niamh. I'd like to make a reply.
Let's go. This debate has already happened for the partners of this firm, who with millions of dollars in advice and billions on the line, decided unilaterally with side negative. Firstly, on self-defense, secondly, on self-destruction. I'll start with self-defense, which is their claim around the long term. Their claim is that people hate the Trump administration and will hate you by extension. We have three broad ways of defeating this. Firstly, we explain that this has not happened empirically in reality, and there are a variety of companies that have done this. For example, there are a class of companies like Amazon, like Apple, like Facebook, who've all worked with the Trump administration. But ask yourself, have people stopped buying iPhones in protest? Have companies stopped working with them? What we explain is far more understandable, which is that companies get and understand exactly why you would make this decision. Secondly, we explained that in the short term, companies have to stay with you and work with you because they need to work with the Trump administration. And then in the long term, if you want to pivot, that's fine. You can move back away in the same way that I'm sure Apple and Amazon, etc. will do. The last response, the sort of last dying claim we get is, well, this will sort of show that you have capitulated, and many people will know about it, and that will be particularly bad. But we explain firstly how many people know about this right now before this debate has taken place, and in particular, this is a firm with a variety of things that stop people from moving away from it. The fact that they are specialized in dealing with regulation to do with the government, the fact that they're, as they concede at third, a variety of reasons to believe that you don't want to shift your firm actually hurts them far more than it hurts us. Because when you only don't want to shift for a small regulatory purpose or for optics reasons, I'm sure that administrative costs will cover it. When you don't want to shift and billions of dollars are at stake because you're not going to get any government contracts, that is definitely something that will bring you over the line in terms of doing that. Let's compare that to the two claims we make in terms of the long term. The first is, I think, the simplest, which is just that now it is far likely you lose the vast majority of your clients and the vast majority of clients that are particularly wealthy. Their only challenge is just to say that that won't happen, that can't happen, because you don't have clients that are excessively wealthy. We explain a variety of actual tangible examples of companies like Exxon, of companies like Northrop, that you do indeed represent. But even if this isn't all of your clients, it is definitely the most wealthy clients. And this is what we explained at first, which is just that clients that get a bunch of government contracts are wealthy because they get a bunch of government contracts, they get a bunch of money for it. Secondly, clients that are in this fashion also tend to be very long-term clients. They're the ones that get a very steady stream of income. That's what a government contract provides to them. And we provide three broad reasons down the bench as to why you're just not likely to get these clients anymore. Firstly, the short-term harm and uncertainty of the fact that even if Trump doesn't land the executive order, he might levy one, and that will mean that none of these companies can get contracts from the government. But secondly, that these firms, like Trump, they agree with him in the vast majority of cases, and he's threatened to attack these firms and to try and get rid of them. And lastly, that Trump has regulated or has tried to stamp down on them. The second and last claim we make is just that the United States government is an extraordinary large client of this firm. Things like Trump adding a bunch of bureaucrats to the government, things like Trump structuring a bunch of organizations. Clearly, in terms of the long term, maybe, yes, you sacrifice one or two really left-wing clients, but the clients that actually matter and bring in the dollars definitely leave under their side, and they leave in droves. Clearly, they lose. Secondly, let's turn to self-destruction and the question of the short term. I'll provide two broad bits of weighing, which is the first and I think simplest, which is just that this is tangibly certain. Like 10 or 15 years ago, people could not have predicted the way in which Trump has shifted the American political landscape. How, for example, things like artificial intelligence might change the way that lawyers react as a whole. It is tangibly certain as to what we provide. But secondly, this goes on to inform the long term, having money, having contracts, having people that hire you, etc. The first claim we make that gets no response is just that Trump will personally target a bunch of people in this firm. They have zero response to this claim. Three broad bits of weighing here. Firstly, this actually stops the firm accessing money in the first place for the reason that if you can't make any billable hours, you don't have any money to bring in, clearly that hurts them. Secondly, it means you're far less likely to get chosen for cases or chosen for contracts, and it informs your long term because you aren't able to hire people. The only claim they make is that there are some pro-democracy cases. We explain that it is quite likely you will lose these cases because Trump will clamp down on you, and that is particularly bad in those instances. They don't explain why you get these cases, and they don't explain why there isn't a commensurate kickback from the Trump administration because he has an incentive to fight over you. They self-destruct and they don't even self-defend.
Thank you, Niamh. Reply. Conclude the debate. I invite half reply.
The camera's falling down.
Reply is going to be sealed.
I'm going to start with why this decision screws them in the long term, because if a negative team claims to care about profitability, presumably they care about profitability post 2028 and probably into the future. What are their responses to what we tell you here? The first thing they say is that Trump is likely to outlast this moment in history, and therefore that is something that we do not need to account for in the future. But I would say maybe that is true a couple of months ago. I think for the reasons that Gypsy identifies, that when we actually see Trump's policies in action, when the leopards start eating people's faces, that is when people actually start going against Trump. When the price of eggs doesn't go down, that is when Trump becomes perceived as a black spot in American history, and that is when your reputation is tarnished into the long term. So I don't think that claim stands. I think this obviously hurts them in the long term when Trump is remembered poorly. Their next claim in response is that the average person just doesn't know enough about the political leanings of the law firm, or just disregards their political leanings because that is just something they don't particularly care about. But I think this just misses the crucial mechanism that we reiterate down the bench, which is that it doesn't matter what your political leaning or your perceived political leaning is as a law firm. It's just that you look really terrible at your job when you capitulate to government pressure, when you're perceived as, which can just flow on into how you deal with a litigation, for example. If you're perceived, that means you could be perceived as likely to settle a claim when you think that there is significant pressure being put on you. It makes you look like a firm that is going to give information to government if they ask you, or change your policies if they ask you, because you have done it in the past. And that just makes you look like a terrible law firm that when companies who do significant amounts of due diligence when they choose to engage a law firm probably looks at and thinks, okay, that's a pretty bad thing, and there are lots of other competitors we can go to otherwise, so that is probably the tipping point that suggests they go to those other law firms. That is something they would weigh particularly highly when they are choosing a law firm to engage. You just look bad at your job, and note there is basically no response to this mechanism down the bench. But finally, we explain that also you just lose a lot of your capacity as a law firm into the future because you lose a significant amount of talent. That you lose a significant amount of talent. Their claim in response is that, well, people don't join law firms for politically motivated reasons, but for the same reason that you just look like a pretty bad law firm that is willing to capitulate to pressure, that will settle cases unnecessarily because you're told to by the Trump administration, is probably a reason that people just don't perceive you as a prestigious or good law firm in the future, and that is just a reason that you wouldn't join that firm as a junior lawyer. But also, for example, if you are denouncing partners left, right, and center, that is a reason why people would choose to leave, because you're denouncing their friends, because that is something those are connections that they care about. And I would weigh this particularly highly because, as Ali explains, when partners leave firms, they take their clients with them and they take the work that is critical to maintaining the profitability of those firms. So you all consider how this affects the future reputation of the firm, being perceived as competent, being perceived as something that should be able to attract talent, because that affects their viability and their profit past 2028. But finally, on the short term, and I would note here that we do just need to prove that you survived the 4 years of Trump that exist, and that basically any small wins that you're able to get, like maybe a couple more government contracts, are probably not worth the trade-off that you make into the future. But I would just suggest there probably are no short-term benefits anyways, because we explained to no response that Trump just probably perceives you as a weak law firm because you capitulated at the first hurdle, which means you are just probably not likely to be picked for those government contracts anyways, and you're not likely to be respected by Trump. So you probably just don't get them anyways. But also, we explain that you can challenge these sorts of policies in the Supreme Court, and that obviously law firms have every incentive to do that in order to maintain their clients and to maintain their profitability, and for the reasons we explained down the bench, that has a reasonably likely chance of success. So you probably don't lose contracts, but also we explain that clients are probably not likely to leave you for the reasons they identify, that it is just relatively difficult to sever your connections and the expertise you have when you've engaged a firm for a long time. And for those reasons, you just lobby the Trump the Trump administration against making this sort of decision, and when it gets out of the news, he probably quietly reverses on it. I think this just suggests that those short-term benefits are incredibly, incredibly minor. You ought weigh the fact that this harms the law firm into the future. Very proud to propose.
All right, thank you, Niamh, for applying that speech. Thank you, our speakers, that debate. Invite over to the floor, shake hands, and exchange.
Great speeches. Great speech. Okay.